Okay, I'm unmuted, and I was just scrolling through the gallery, and I see a number of old friends here, so I'm very, very happy to welcome you and everybody else to this evening of Narrative Medicine Rounds. I'm Carolyn Westhoff, and narrative medicine arose at Columbia in 2001. It's now an international movement, an international project, which intersects humanities, arts, clinical medicine, and healthcare justice. Narrative training equips clinicians to humbly try to comprehend their patients' experiences, which certainly me, working in reproductive health for the last roughly 50 years, can certainly endorse how important that is in the area that we're going to be discussing tonight. Practice of narrative medicine helps those interested to be person-centered and respectful, to deepen their self-awareness, and narrative medicine community assembles monthly at these rounds. And I do have to do a little bit of housekeeping for everybody before we move into tonight's conversation. Everybody, please keep your microphone muted. We will take questions, but we won't look at the chat until a little bit later. So you can put questions in the chat now, but it'll take a little while till we get to them. If there are any inappropriate comments or disruptions in the chat, the facilitators might remove you from the event. We're going to be locking the meeting in a couple minutes, and we will have if your connection is broken, you may not be able to return to the meeting, but there will be a recording later. I understand in past years, the meetings have at least once had an intrusion, and if so, the entire event gets shut down if that occurs. As I mentioned, we'll do very little chat to start out with, and then but we will do a lot of chatting, as much as you want, at the end, and I will probably read questions straight off the chat rather than unmute people, but we'll kind of play that by ear. Everybody will, at the end, there'll be a link to the online bookstore so you can order Josh's book and get more information. And with that, I'm ready to introduce Josh Prager on your screen, who is the author of the book, The Family Roe. And Josh also, we've just been talking about this, wrote an award-winning book about Major League Baseball. So his interests have a great breadth, and I'm happy about all of that. But Josh has written for numerous publications, as well as his books. He's won awards. And for this book, The Family Roe, he spent over a decade doing the prep work to put the book together. And it's kind of astonishing in a way, in a bad way, that the book just came out at a time that is of such urgent historic importance around the availability of abortion in the United States. And we will, I think, be able to, discuss that particular topic. What I was telling everybody a little while ago is I'm sitting in my study at home, which is filled with bookshelves. I have an entire shelf filled with books about abortion. And I actually went to start counting them and look at what they were. Some of the books are clinical, some of them are epidemiological, philosophical, feminist. There's a full range, but what the books really don't tell is the stories of people who have been involved. Sometimes in the world of abortion, we hear stories of women who've undergone an abortion, but this is a really different point of view. And so I'm eager to have Josh tell me how he came to this place.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Thank you, Dr. Sharon, and everyone at the Narrative Medicine Program for having me here this evening. It really is an honor. As a writer of narrative nonfiction, I, like all of you, believe very much in listening. and also in the power of stories to open minds, even when writing about something as polarizing as abortion. The legal scholar Lawrence Tribe once wrote that the only way to rise above the clash inherent in Roe versus Wade was by, as he wrote, giving voice to the human reality on each side of the versus. And that is exactly what I set out to do in my book. And so I carefully selected protagonists whose lives touched on every facet of abortion in America: law and medicine, gender and autonomy, race and class, religion and sex. At the heart of the book is Norma McCorvey. She was a dispossessed gay woman in Dallas who in 1970, pregnant for the third time and desperately wanting an abortion, became Jane Roe. I spent hundreds of hours with Norma. I discovered her private papers in the garage of her former longtime partner, and I was at her side when she passed away in 2017. Norma was really uniquely suited to telling the larger story of abortion in America, because as a child, her family had become Jehovah's Witnesses, and for her, the seeming irreconcilability, of religion and sex had left her deeply ambivalent, not only about sex and her sexuality, but about abortion too. And in time, she publicly renounced Roe. She came to represent those who opposed it. But privately, just like the majoritarian middle ground in this country, she believed that abortion ought to be legal through the first trimester of pregnancy. And she wanted it known that she had never had an abortion, but had given birth to 3 daughters she had relinquished to adoption. I found those daughters and I wrote about them, the youngest of whom was the Roe baby, whose unwanted conception had led to the filing of Roe. So as to better contextualize their stories, I also wrote of a lawyer and 2 doctors who were at the heart of Roe and yet had lived lives all but unknown. The lawyer was Linda Coffey, a brilliant gay feminist Baptist who conceived of the Roe lawsuit and filed it, and yet now lives on food stamps in an unheated house in East Texas. And the 2 doctors were Mildred Jefferson and Curtis Boyd. Excuse me. Jefferson was the first Black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School, and she became the architect of the pro-life movement, all the while harboring great personal secrets. And it was above all Dr. Boyd, a former fundamentalist Christian, who is today the largest provider of third trimester abortion in America, who prefigured the attitudinal shift of the pro-choice movement from seeing abortion as something that ought to be rare. President Clinton famously said, safe, legal, and rare, to something, as Dr. Boyd put it, good and moral, something that only empowered women. I mention in my author's note that I am pro-choice, but I recognize that abortion is fraught for good reason, as I see it, and I wrote the book not as an advocate, but as a journalist. It contains revelations that both sides have seized upon. I could go on. I spent 11 years on the book. When I started, I did not have reading glasses, but I thought it would be better if Carolyn and I spoke about it together.
Great, thank you, Josh. I think it's amazing. I just over the last few weeks, I read the book, and a lot of the people who you cover in the book are people who I know. And I mean, in particular, the physicians that you covered are people I've known personally over the years. And we're at such a moment now with the Supreme Court, and I'm happy to just keep getting into that today because I think it might be top of mind for many people on the call. But so how do you think these stories about these different people, how do you think that can inform how people view our legal crossroads right now?
Well, it's interesting. I'm not a lawyer. I majored in music theory in college. And so for me, I came to this with really fresh eyes. And I remember when I was first reading through the Roe ruling that Justice Blackmun wrote on behalf of the majority opinion of the court in 1973. What was fascinating to me was how readable it was. And he mentions in there, he mentions actually that most people's views of abortion are informed by experience. He says, by the raw edges of human existence. And that really made sense to me. It resonated with me. And the more I looked into it, the more I noticed that this was the case for almost everyone who figured in my story, starting with Justice Blackmun. He mentioned that, the raw edges of human existence. He doesn't mention that just a few years before, his own daughter in college had found herself unhappily pregnant. And that unhappy pregnancy had really redirected her life. One of Justice Blackmun's fellow justices, Justice Powell, another Republican appointee, he later wrote, he noted that when he was working at a law firm, there was a messenger boy who had come to him desperate. This is, of course, pre-Roe, desperate because he had brought his girlfriend to an abortion provider. She had died, and he was now wanted for manslaughter. And he was hoping that the future justice could help him. And just to mention one more example from someone in the courtroom that day, Sarah Weddington, the lawyer arguing the case on behalf of Jane Roe. She had not told anyone yet that she herself had had an abortion. And she was not a person who would otherwise, by her own admission, who would otherwise have sort of come to this. She was very, middle class America. She was part of a sorority and the Future Homemakers Society of America and all that. And yet, of course, her life had been forever changed by this experience. And so I believe that the way to do this book was to sort of tell it through not politics, but people. And in so doing, we would come to a very human understanding of how, after 50 years since Roe, of how we have come now to the point where Roe is on the precipice of being overturned.
I think one thing that has been, much discussed among people who worry about abortion is how much stigma there is for patients and for doctors too, but for really anybody involved in the world of abortion. And there was some work that people have done in recent years called Shout Your Abortion, where women who've had an abortion could stand up and talk about it to reduce the stigma. I don't know if you've heard about that, or you were talking about people involved really in the legal process predominantly, but do you think if women tell their stories, do you think the Shout Your Abortion approach could have any useful impact on public opinion? What do you think?
It's a great question. And in fact, since even pre-Roe, there were sort of what they call, speak outs, where women would get together and speak about their abortions. I know that in the first issue of Ms. Magazine, Gloria Steinem and others, there was a list of women speaking about the abortions that they'd had, mm-hmm. and on and on and on. What's so fascinating is that now both sides of this sort of, sadly, what is really an American war, have come to that exact same recognition and are trying to use stories to harness, to win the public over to their side. So on the pro-choice side, as you say, there's a whole slew of these sort of online initiatives. One of them is Shout Your Abortion. On the pro-life side, what's really fascinating is, and this actually has a lot to do with Norma. There's a man named Alan Parker, who's head of an organization in Texas called the Justice Foundation. And he has for decades now been collecting affidavits from women who say that they were harmed emotionally by their abortion. Now, what's fascinating about that is, of course, there are individuals who have been harmed emotionally by their abortion. But the data show, endless studies show that the overwhelming majority of women who have abortions report feeling not regret, but relief Whereas women who surrender their child to adoption, which is exactly what the pro-life world is sort of advocating that women do, and what Justice Amy Coney Barrett raised several times during oral arguments in Dobbs' case, a very large percentage of those women actually do report feeling years later sort of emotionally scarred by that. But nonetheless, you have the Supreme Court sort of getting these enormous amicus briefs with stories from both sides now, sort of trying to use storytelling to prevail upon the justices.
Yes, well, one thing, it's a bit of one of my jobs is editing the journal Contraception, but notwithstanding the name, I would say globally, we are the main journal to publish papers on the topic of abortion. So I do get to see a lot of that. And really because of Tony Barrett's comments just a couple months ago about that in essence, to oversimplify, that adoption would solve everything because people of course have that option. Some of my colleagues are right this minute pulling together some information from a qualitative study about women who in fact had that opportunity and how they felt about it and how that all turned out. The paper's not finished yet. I haven't seen it yet, but you know, it's another place where we don't hear women's voices.
Yeah. Well,
and
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll just say what was fascinating to me about Norma. She's like, all roads lead through Norma in terms of abortion in America, Norma McCorvey. And it was Alan Parker who comes to Norma to represent Norma so that he can sort of piggyback her famous plaintiffship to start submitting these affidavits into the judicial system. One of his affidavits was then cited by Justice Kennedy a few years ago, which really like legitimated gave legitimacy to the pro-life side saying that abortion harms women. So it was sort of through Norma that he was able to do that. And on the pro-choice side, I was able to writing about Norma, here's a woman again who never had an abortion, but surrendered 3 children to adoption. And she spoke literally to her dying day about the enormous cost that took on her, the enormous emotional toll that surrendering those kids had on her. And so, you know, I was able in the book to sort of show, the old journalism cliche, show, don't tell, and you see just how utterly devastating it is. And it's just intuitive that if you have a child who's somewhere out there and you don't know what is happening with him or her, you want to know, and it's very, very painful. And so, you know, when Amy Coney Barrett, Justice Barrett said that, I was thinking, you know, she really ought to know Norma's story. It's not as simple as she's saying it, oh, relinquish your child and then everything is fine.
Well, one thing that was interesting about the book was that you went back a few generations in the McCorvey family, and there were, I guess I'll jump in with, you know, there were stories there about, you know, unintended pregnancy, giving babies up. And I think probably many of us can look back into our own family history and wonder about what happened back in the days before Roe. But
you're right. And I didn't know that was there when I started. It just struck me, I need to know where Norma comes from. And what was fascinating is I went back 2 generations, and both her mother and her grandmother, like her, had unwanted pregnancies at the age of 17. And those pregnancies redirected their lives. One of them had a shotgun marriage and ended up having a complicated life. And the other one, which was really staggering and painful, Norma's mother, Mary, gets pregnant And as happened, I learned through the writing of this book, she was basically disappeared. It was too embarrassing, too humiliating for her family, who lived right across the Atchafalaya River from her in rural Louisiana, to have this happen. So they made her go to the big city in Baton Rouge. You know, her belly could grow sort of without anyone seeing it there. And then, which really destroyed Mary, when the child was born, her parents then took the child, raised the child as their own, and then Mary went back and became an alcoholic, and her life was never the same. And that was then the home that Norma was born into. So I wanted people to see, hey, the long shadow of, you know, when abortion is not legal, you see what happens. And I was able to sort of look at one family, 5 generations of a family, and you see it's a very difficult thing. One of the things, just to jump ahead, that I thought was really quite beautiful, one of Norma's 3 children, and the only one Norma had known at all, not the Roe baby, not the middle child, Jennifer, but Melissa. She was actually adopted by Mary. So just as this full circle, just as she had sort of had her child raised by her mother, Norma had had her child raised by her mother. And Melissa said, you know what, this endless cycle stops with me. I'm going to be a good mom. I'm going to devote myself endlessly to sort of motherhood. And she did so, and she has done so. And it's a really heroic thing to say, I'm going to do something different than was done to me.
Well, I could say, I mean, you know, I have so many stories going back in my own family, or, you know, kids I grew up with that resonate with the stories you tell in the book. One thing I wonder about, and this is to kind of bring things very locally to our, you know, education of healthcare students right at Columbia. It is, you know, what we can teach them and where they're going to get their information, because of course, so many American women will undergo an abortion at some time. And obviously there are also a lot of other adverse reproductive health experiences that people go through, but abortion is going to be the one that's most likely to be hidden, and so students may not be aware of how common it is. I know one of the people on the call here is my colleague. I see her, Debbie Teplin, who's a physician's assistant. She provides abortion care, but most abortion care around here is limited to OBGYNs. Only about 5% of medical school graduates go into OBGYN. And how do we make sure that other you know, nurses and doctors who aren't directly in OBGYN is a big enough problem because we have to figure out how to educate them. But I think it would be better for women if all healthcare providers have some familiarity with abortion and understand these kinds of stories. I don't know, what might you think about that?
Well, what that brings to mind is really the story of Dr. Boyd, who, you know, his story is remarkable. Just to step back for 1 minute, he's growing up in a very religious home in Texas, and he in high school he has a crush on a girl his age named Virginia, and she gets pregnant, and her life is never the same. She's a pariah. It wasn't even her boyfriend, but the boy she was with, the captain of the football team, he's sort of seen as a stud by his friends, and they're slapping him on the back, and she is really she has to leave school. She's no longer welcome at the church, etc. And all of a sudden, Curtis is sort of starting to think, reconsidering everything and saying, wait a minute, this just doesn't seem right. And it sends him off on this long journey. And one of the things that was very powerful, he's a very smart man, the valedictorian of his high school class, did very well in college, very well in medical school, one of the most painful things for him to date, I think, is that he is now, as I mentioned, the largest provider of third trimester abortion in America. We could talk about that, but for most of his career, he's now in his 80s. For most of his career, he was not providing third trimester abortion. He started doing that after his friend Dr. Tiller was murdered. And you follow his progression from when he first starts providing abortion pre-Roe. The first one, the woman who comes to him is about 10 weeks pregnant until where he is now. And that was all a run up to say, he, to this day, it is very painful to him that he is often looked down upon by his fellow doctors. He feels that there is an enormous stigma, not only within the community, the country at large, but within the medical community. And he feels that, that's why he has always wanted to sort of reimagine abortion, the way he has always put it, again, as only something that is a social and moral good. And he feels that if it can be looked at that way, then even just in medical schools, there will not be stigma attached to it. I really think it goes back to what you were saying earlier about the stigma of abortion, because there are many doctors who don't wish to do it. Dr. Tiller, who was killed before I had a chance to interview him, but I spoke to, as I do in this book, and I spoke to everyone in his life. What attracted him to this field was he felt that it was the intimacy that he sort of was able to establish with his patients in the best way, people confiding in him their stories. And I think if people understand, if I'm putting myself in the shoes of a doctor who is training and trying to think of which field I might go into, and obviously this is silly me telling this to you, you've devoted, a half century to this. But I do think that if I fully understood the role that I might play in the lives of young women and older women who wish to have an abortion, I think it might then become something that I decided to do, because the people for 50 years, Dr. Boyd explained to me that the women he was providing abortions for were unbelievably indebted to him, and to this day look to him as really one of the most important people in their lives.
I think that's true, and that should be true. I know Curtis Boyd well, and he's a wonderful person and very devoted to his patients. But I think there's another side, which is also interesting to experience, that not only do you perhaps not get respect from your own professional colleagues if you're an abortion provider, but often you don't get respect from the patients you actually take care of. And that's fascinating. And I think, this is
why is that?
Well, down the road of abortion stigma, there are a couple things that go on. There are a lot of people who are more or less against abortion, as I think has been widely stated, until they need one themselves. And then they will often think, oh, well, my circumstances are special. My abortion is special, so this one's okay, but what's wrong with all those other women?
Well, you've heard people say, when should abortion be legal? Rape, incest, and me. I've a bunch of people sort of say that to me. And in fact, like what you're saying, Dr. Boyd told me that he actually recognized over the years, he's had thousands of people protest at his clinic. He's had his clinic firebombed. I mean, he's endured everything. But he's actually had several people he recognized from the protest lines outside of his clinic come to him for abortions. So that doesn't surprise me now, given what you're saying.
Absolutely. And I would say that's probably true for every doctor I know who provides abortion care, that we have provided care for anti-abortion activists. And they then go right back on to their picket line afterwards, after they've gotten so it's again, my abortion was special. What's wrong with all those other women? Which I think is a really enormous problem. I've had I've literally had one patient stands to mind in particular who said to me after, she had like a late second trimester kind of complicated abortion. We took care of her. She was fine. And she said to me in follow-up, thank you so much for taking care of me, but how can you do this? You seem like such a good doctor. How can you do this?
You know what? That doesn't surprise me. And it goes, I mentioned Norma's upbringing. Well, one of the other central characters in the book I mentioned briefly is Linda Coffey, right? She was this woman who represented Norma. She is the original person to sort of conceive of the case, file the case, even though her co-counsel, Sarah Weddington, was much more famous. I mentioned that because what was fascinating to me, I didn't know this when I started in this. So Roe, of course, is filed in 1970. It's decided in 1973. Well, Linda Coffey is growing up a religious Baptist woman in Texas. And she was comfortable. She was able to do what she did and feel good about herself, because here she is, not only a feminist, but gay and a pioneer in the world of reproductive rights. And the Southern Baptist Convention had no problem with her. The Southern Baptist Convention was not only had no problem with her, they were pro-choice. Read what they said until around 1980. Not only that, they were proud of her. They featured her in their Baptist newsletter in 1973. So I mention that because I think if you're growing up in a home where there is room for you at your parents' table, room for you in your church, then you are not going to feel bad. And you will not have the person say to you, how can you do what you do? But if you don't, then, they will not. I'll just mention one other story. Again, we go back to storytelling, and it was always fascinating to me to look behind the sort of public figures. Well, Mildred Jefferson, Dr. Jefferson, who I mentioned, the first African-American woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School, a very brilliant woman. Everyone, the pro-life world looks at her as sort of, one of their saints. They say that she left the heights of the medical profession to devote herself to the unborn. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. I got her FBI file, and what that file showed me was that the reason she left medicine for the world of the pro-life world was because there was no room for her, sadly, in medicine, because she was a Black woman. She couldn't get accredited. What is the word? She couldn't get certified.
Board certified, right?
Yeah, board certified as a surgeon. The whatever the official name is of the board of surgery in America, they had never certified a Black woman until 1968. And so she, almost 20 years, she sort of labored and was pushed away and could not rise up in her profession. And she was so exasperated by that this is really fascinating. I found her ex-husband. Here is a woman, Dr. Jefferson, who later comes to tell people, and she's the head of the National Right to Life Committee. She brings Ronald Reagan into the fold. She's a very powerful woman. And she says that every single conception must lead to a birth. Abortion can never be legal, she says. But privately, do you know what she did? Privately, she says to her husband that right before they get married, she says, I will only marry you if you agree to never have a child, because this world is too unjust to bring a child into it, given all of the suffering that I had endured. And that is a remarkable thing, to sort of privately think this and publicly say that. And so, over and over and over again, I come back to, why do people do what they do? Basically because of their personal experiences. And that is in the world of abortion more than any other world, because it's so stigmatized.
So before we move into the Q&A section in a minute, I just want to share with people a little bit about what we actually do at Columbia, at Badgelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. And I've been here I don't know, a really long time, 35 years, something like that. And abortion was pretty much ostracized in the Department of OBGYN or in any hospital-based OBGYN unit in the past, because prior to Roe, the people who actually provided abortions often were trained physicians, but they were physicians who had been forced out of the profession, usually due to professional misconduct. And some of that comes from all those books on my shelf. But so the people who were providing abortions weren't necessarily incompetent, but they had been, pushed out of the professional fold for various kinds of bad behavior. And so being an abortion provider was associated with other stigma over and above doing abortion itself. When I was probably in my first or second year at Columbia, one of the other attendings, and this is pretty funny as the years have gone by, walking down the hall with me after grand rounds, reaches up and puts his arm around me as we're walking down the hall. Now that would not fly any longer, right? It was actually fairly shocking at the time. And he said, "Carolyn, don't be the abortionist." So that was an interesting bit of career advice, right? That I shouldn't do that at Columbia. And certainly for myself, I kind of was following the, the actual coin of the realm at Columbia, which is writing grants and writing papers. So I had a way to have a place in the academic setting without solely being identified or stigmatized as an abortion provider. But so what we started doing around 25 years ago is we began a program to train young OBGYNs in abortion care, as well as, and this was our fellowship in family planning. Last year in 2021, our fellowship received national certification as a subspecialty by the Accreditation Council on Graduate Medical Education. So it's become official. And the strategy for these fellowships going back 25 years was to try to put them into the most prestigious, well-established, well-known medical schools. And it was really directly done to counter what the stigma is about this. So that Harvard and Yale and Columbia and Hopkins and Chicago and San Francisco and so on all had abortion training programs. And I think it's had a huge impact on the field. And, the number of advertisements right now of academic medical centers trying to recruit somebody who's an abortion provider for a faculty position has overwhelmed our supply. The fellowships around the country have trained several hundred young OBGYNs in this field. And so it's really been a change because, we can't ask Curtis Boyd to work forever. Can't ask me to work forever either. We need younger people to do the work, and we have lots of them. It does not solve the problem of hostile states and all the wider problems of medical care in the hostile states. But it was a very concerted effort. There was a lot of foundation funding, anonymous foundation funding that went to make these programs possible. And what we have now done over 25 years or so is institutionalize abortion training and provision in 25 of the most reputable academic medical centers around the country. So it's a way of destigmatizing the role for OBGYNs. And so I'm just tremendously happy that I've been able to be part of that process. It took a long time, and this year, we've got a lot of horrible things going on, but we have board certification, which is the ultimate kind of endorsement of legitimacy in the medical profession. So that's been great. And now I'm seeing that there are some questions, and we'll just see. Yes, New York State passed the Reproductive Health Act in 2019. And here's a comment in the chat that says that this states correctly that this law eliminated the gestational age restriction on the availability for abortion. And while there are conditions, that is true. And the way this was promoted in the media was that a woman could now have an abortion in New York State at 40 weeks. Was this the best way to launch the concept of the removal of gestational age restriction? And yes, what was behind removing the gestational age restriction? Well, I'm happy to answer all of that, but part of the statement here is that this would allow the decision to be something made between the patient and her healthcare provider, rather than a decision that gets made in the political arena. And I could talk about that for hours. I won't do that. I would like Josh to weigh in on the Reproductive Health Act if he has some thoughts about that.
Well, what is obviously now coming down the pike, and what is prompting all of these different legislations, I guess, on both sides, is that, judging by the oral arguments in Dobbs, the two justices who legal scholars feel are most likely to, among the conservative sort of contingent, the two justices who might side with Justice Roberts in not wanting to overturn Roe completely are Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh, because the other three conservative justices have made it clear that they would like to. Basically, they haven't, well, two of them have said it, Thomas and Alito, but Gorsuch has also indicated that in a lot of the writing he did about euthanasia, actually, if you're reading between the lines. But both of those justices, it really seemed to most legal scholars, indicated during the Dobbs oral arguments that they are going to be overturning Roe. Justice Kavanaugh, over and again, was talking about other instances when the Supreme Court had overturned precedent, longstanding precedent. And we already mentioned that Justice Amy Coney Barrett had spoken several times of, adoption as a potential sort of, panacea here. So it does look like the question of abortion is going to go back to the states. And you have some organizations like the Center for Reproductive Rights and the sort of pro-life equivalents who are speculating as to where the different states will fall on this question. It really does look, it's almost half and half. And unfortunately, it will be often states where women who are poor, women of color, who are not going to have a legal right to abortion. They're going to have to travel. And so you have basically now states that are saying, well, we're going to do our part to make sure that abortion is legal no matter what. And in some instances, like, potentially here in New York, even, at a later point in pregnancy, Dr. Boyd works in New Mexico, and I believe it's one of 7 states right now where there is no gestational limit. I think, though, the big thing, there's a lot of work to do, is going to be helping people in the states where abortion is not legal get to where it is legal. And it's not a simple thing. You need to get there. You need time off from your job. You need someone to watch your kids. It's going to be complicated. And I know that a lot of organizations are beginning right now to work on that. I think it's really going to be a reality in just a few months, which is really shocking. I think Roe v. Wade is done.
We've been fearing it for so long, and it's hard to believe that perhaps we are now there. So the Reproductive Health Act in New York actually languished a long time before it finally got passed, and that was really hard work by a wide range of organizations, healthcare organizations and activist organizations. But New York's law that was passed, and I'm not a legal expert, and I would probably flunk even a multiple choice test right now on some of the elements of these different laws. But the Reproductive Health Act was designed to replace New York's law from 1970, which had a number of, which at that time was very liberal compared to the rest of the United States, but really had a lot of weaknesses. And in terms of gestational age limit, so yes, we need every possible state to pass their own laws and codify some degree of abortion rights. Of course, many states are just codifying extreme restrictions. But the Reproductive Health Act liberalized the gestational age limits. And I'm just going to be vague about how that looks, because this is kind of a, East Coast big city kind of thing. Pregnant women get a lot of prenatal testing, and sometimes terrible disorders with the pregnancy are really discovered quite late. And with the previous limitations, it might not be possible to take care of those women if some devastating fetal anomaly is discovered very late. We had in past years sometimes referred some of those women to Dr. Boyd in New Mexico, for instance, because they couldn't get in. No hospital in New York was willing to take care of them for fear that they would get into legal trouble, even, because the old law wasn't quite so clear. So the new law tries to be very explicit that a woman and a clinician can make a decision around her health and around fetal problems, and that they can make those decisions into the third trimester. Now, I think we don't know what's actually happening yet. I mean, I talk with other clinicians working in this area around New York. Very few people are doing abortions after 24 weeks, which is kind of the line that everybody has used all these decades. So just now with one of our fellows, we are putting together a study to evaluate all the high-risk centers in New York State and try to find out how their practices have changed since the act passed in 2019, because actually nobody knows. And, we've identified, I think, 17 centers that provide the most high-risk care in New York, because we think that if anywhere, that's where the new law would be guiding practice. We take care of plenty of women who have devastating medical problems diagnosed during pregnancy, or devastating medical problems that arise due to the pregnancy itself, as well as the fetal problems that get diagnosed and sometimes just can't be diagnosed early. But so right now in New York, I don't think anybody thinks an otherwise healthy woman is strolling in and asking for an abortion late in the third trimester. And but we don't know. We don't know, and so we're gonna study it now to find out what's happening.
One thing that was interesting, you mentioned the sort of, healthy woman strolling in. That hypothetical woman was what Dr. Boyd sort of wrestled with over the years. And I charted his progression little by little by little as he went from 10 weeks to 16 weeks to 24 weeks, and then ended up where he is. And he finally said, look, I've been providing abortions for all these years, and that woman has never come into my door. And therefore, I am now going to step in and continue to provide abortions into the third trimester. He actually ended up coming to, what I do think is a somewhat radical conclusion, that he decided that because that woman has never come into my clinic, I will actually provide abortion right up until birth, depending on, what it is that she needs. But what was interesting for me in writing about him was to see how much he wrestled about this. And it was basically over about 25 years that you could chart his sort of progression. it's not an easy thing. No matter where a person, obviously, you know this better than I, but no matter where a person ends up, if you're an abortion provider, it's a complicated thing to decide what you're going to do.
Well, I think for all providers, just from the point of view of safety, if nothing else, we would prefer to do abortions earlier rather than later.
Yeah.
They become more complex, more difficult, more risky. And just by the way, for people on the call who might not know this, at any stage of pregnancy, an abortion is medically safer than continuing the pregnancy 9 months and giving birth. So people talk about what all the risks are. And here's my radical statement for the evening. For any pregnant woman, the safer outcome for her always is to have an abortion. The risky thing to do is to go 9 months. So from a medical point of view, of course, she's going to take those risks and go 9 months because she wants a baby. But from a medical point of view, that is always the riskier thing to do. I think, of course, there's also a tendency to look at abortion in an absolutist, dichotomous way, black, white, yes, no, of course it's okay, of course it's not. But I think doctors, but most important, women themselves see a gradient. I mean, I think every patient I take care of sees a gradient. And if they're thinking about an abortion, they would prefer to have it as early as possible. And everybody sees there's a gradient of development that for them changes whatever the nature or value of the fetus might be. And women are not cavalier about waiting until later to have an abortion. They want it done right away if that's what the best route is for them.
Yeah, and what I was just going to say is I totally agree with you, but also just sort of in learning about the history of abortion in this country over the last 50 years, the two sides have gotten more and more, they've gotten further and further apart. And so, for example, whereas Dr. Jefferson was one of just like 3 of maybe 50 people who were members of the leadership of the National Right to Life Committee who believed that abortion ought to never be legal. Everyone else on the board, pretty much everyone, felt that abortion ought to be legal in cases of rape and incest. Now, of course, it's completely common. You have state after state passing these, these trigger bans that abortion will be completely illegal in cases of rape and incest, even if Roe is overturned. And on the other side, what was interesting for me to see was that the National Abortion Federation was actually very uncomfortable with Dr. Tiller, as you and I briefly discussed in 1985, when he had just started performing abortions, in the 3rd trimester. And so I think that it is important for people to be mindful on both sides that abortion is complicated and gets more complicated the further, the deeper into the pregnancy you go. And I think politics, unfortunately, are a big reason why we are where we are. People what was interesting to me, I didn't realize this, but when Roe was first, ruled upon, it actually wasn't, it wasn't so polarizing. The first potential justice at his hearing for the Supreme Court after Roe was ruled upon, Justice Stevens, he literally wasn't even asked his opinion of Roe during his hearing. Now, basically, these hearings are just proxies for Roe. And so things have changed. And why is that changed? Well, there are big debates over that. Justice Ginsburg, the late Justice Ginsburg, famously said that she felt Roe was partially to blame. She felt that it had sort of galvanized those who are opposed to it. And she felt that not only did she feel it ought not to have gone to the Supreme Court, it ought to have gone state by state, but she also felt that it should have been, the legal right to abortion ought to have been rooted in a right to equality, not a right to privacy. But then you have others like, Linda Greenhouse, the great journalist who writes for the New York Times and teaches at Yale. And she says, well, actually, Roe is being politicized abortion was being politicized even before Roe. And she points to a remarkable memo that President Nixon, one of his advisors, Pat Buchanan, gave to him, saying, you know what, you really need to, there are votes to be won among left-leaning Catholics. If you come out and say, you know what, I'm actually very much opposed to abortion. He had to that point not been opposed to it, and then he does that, and they started siphoning votes off. So politics, and now, of course, you know, there's no greater indicator of political party than abortion. You're pro, you know, you're one here. So I think that's a big part of the reason that it's so polarizing.
Being against abortion is just a cheap way to get votes in a lot of conservative areas, and allows you to ignore all sorts of other pressing domestic issues that need attention instead. Well, there's one question I'd like to wind up with, which is, what might we recommend as the most effective course of activism for people who are interested in furthering reproductive rights? And
you should take that.
Well, you know, I've worked on a lot of different kinds of projects over the years, and I mean, this great divide in the United States is not simply about abortion. The very states that are most hostile to abortion are much more broadly hostile to women. And we need to, they have the highest rate, Mississippi has the highest rate of maternal mortality in the country. It's not just that you can't get an abortion, you can't get maternity care. And I think that there are clearly a lot of places that hate poor people and hate Black people, right? No surprise there. And there, you know, and we can kind of recognize that that occurs in certain areas. And part of that is that poor people, especially poor people of color, cannot get access to medical care, and they can't get access to contraception, and they can't get access to early abortion. And so we need to work on some of those things. And a popular, perhaps a more digestible kind of thing is the idea of, do you know, almost 50% of all babies born in the United States are born on Medicaid? And people may not be aware of that. And for most of those women, Medicaid disappears within 6 weeks. After giving birth, one of the great things we can do, we ought to do it right here in New York, and we need to do it around the country. There are currently some demonstration projects, is get pregnancy-related Medicaid to last for a year, for 12 months instead of for 6 weeks. And that would have a huge beneficial effect on women's health. And we need to get coverage for those women to support their lives, because the issue of reproductive justice goes far beyond access to abortion. You know, we need women to, you know, have the babies they want when they want, and to be able to raise them, right? These are the tenets of reproductive justice. And so we need to think about all of that. And I do think it's a problem if we get too narrowly focused on access to abortion. There's a lot more health care, particularly needed by poor women. And so I think we ought to be trying to address all of that, and we should be trying to get better insurance coverage through Medicaid for poor women. I think that's something to keep your eyes on.
I would only add one thing to that. I'm glad you mentioned Mississippi, because one of the things that I came to realize when I was writing this is that obviously, you know, you have these big, powerful organizations in New York and Washington, D.C. and stuff like that. But just as class can be a divider between those who believe in legal abortion and those who oppose it, it is sadly sometimes also a divider even within those who support a right to abortion. And I think sometimes the people on the front lines are forgotten about, and they're not. And I think if someone wants to be, you know, the question, how do I help? I would go straight to the people who really need the help in the states where they need it, and turn to those organizations there, those clinics, and ask them, how can I help you? Because I heard it many times from abortion providers there, that feeling that they were sometimes forgotten about, because they weren't as closely as aligned with some of the big organizations in the Northeast.
Yeah, and I mean, throughout all medical care, we actually have a divide. It's not just that you can't get abortion in certain states. There's you can't get a primary care provider either. There are a lot of larger problems with the structure of medical care in the United States. So I just want to acknowledge one comment that just appeared in the chat about how pregnant teenage girls were ostracized in a variety of ways, while the boys who got them pregnant weren't. Right? That, yeah, certainly in my high school, it was indeed the captain of the football team who got one of the cheerleaders pregnant. He just stayed, captain of the football team, found another girlfriend, was the homecoming king and queen, and so on. Whereas the girl who got pregnant just went away to live with her grandparents, and then until she, had that baby and gave it up.
Sorry, one thing to that. I really think, I'm a man, and I started writing about this subject. I came into it because I knew I wanted to write, as we mentioned, about the Roe baby, and that brought me into this larger issue. It grew to involve Norma, and then Roe, and then all of abortion in America. And it opened my eyes to how often it is men making decisions on behalf of women. I mean, you had the American Medical Association was all men. For so many years, deciding when an abortion can be viewed as "quote unquote" therapeutic or not. And of course, the Supreme Court, when Roe was decided upon, was all men. And I just want to mention, I think it's a really good thing that even though there right now is this conservative bloc where, it looks good that we will now soon have a fourth woman justice on the court. And, it's about time that the court ought to better reflect, our world. And I think if there are more women in power, then more women will be empowered. And this is obviously a place where men have for too long been deciding, making up the rules for women. And there was that famous line from Gloria Steinem: if men got pregnant, then abortion would be a sacrament. I mean, I think there's actually some truth to that.
Sure there is. Well, we have well run over our time. I want to thank you, Josh, very much. I think there's a final slide to go up on the screen about how to get Josh's book, and also the forthcoming session here in April, where there will be a session related to suicide. And anyway, you'll all be able to get emails about that. And so I recommend people will get a chance to hear more of these stories by reading Josh's book. And thank you all very much for joining us tonight.
Okay. Thank you very much. It really was an honor for me. Thank you.